Hashtag at 100, Dick Van Dyke reveals the 5 people he hated the most. At 100, Dick Van Dyke had already lived longer than most Hollywood careers ever survive. He had danced across movie screens, stumbled through living rooms, made generations laugh, and somehow carried the image of a man who rarely seemed angry. Yet behind that gentle smile were difficult jobs, painful mistakes, broken relationships, rejection, and parts of his own career he could not stand. The record does not support a literal list of 5 people he hated. What it reveals is more interesting. 5 forces that tested the man America thought it knew. Dick Van Dyke reached his 100th birthday on December 13th, 2025. As of 2026, he is 100, not 101. At that age, most people might look backward and see a finished life. Van Dyke looked forward. When asked what it felt like to reach a century, his answer was surprisingly simple. 100 years, he said, was not enough. He wanted to live more. That sentence tells something important about him. The public had spent decades seeing Dick Van Dyke as the eternal optimist, the man who danced, the man who fell over furniture and somehow made it look effortless, the man who could walk into a scene and make the room feel lighter. PBS described him as a performer whose career stretched across 8 decades, from television to Broadway to films such as Mary Poppins and Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. But a long career leaves marks. There were jobs he hated. There were choices that damaged the people closest to him. There were performances he later looked at differently. There were moments when Hollywood said no. And there were mistakes he eventually had to face without the protection of a television audience. So the question is not really whether Dick Van Dyke had 5 enemies. The evidence suggests something deeper. What did he struggle against? And what did those struggles cost him? The first answer came surprisingly early in his career. Before the sitcom. Before Mary Poppins. Before he became one of the most recognizable faces in American entertainment. There was a television job he absolutely did not enjoy. And he remembered it years later. It was called Mother's Day. The show came from a nightclub in Manhattan, and Van Dyke later recalled that he had done several CBS game shows he was not particularly interested in. Then he described Mother's Day in much stronger terms. He hated it. The reason was not complicated. The show included diaper-changing contests. For a performer who dreamed about theater, music, comedy, and serious stage work, this was not the direction he wanted his life to take. Every day, when the show ended, he would leave and go audition for theater productions. He would audition for anything. Musicals, Shakespeare, whatever might get him closer to the stage he wanted. The Television Academy preserved his recollection of that period, including his description of the game show and his determination to keep auditioning. That detail matters because it changes the usual Hollywood story. Van Dyke did not simply become famous. He kept moving when the work in front of him felt wrong. And that raises an uncomfortable question for anyone watching. If a job pays the bills, but slowly takes someone away from the career they truly want, should they stay because they are grateful for the opportunity, or leave before the wrong opportunity becomes their identity? Van Dyke chose movement, and eventually the decision paid off. He landed a role in Bye Bye Birdie. He learned to dance specifically for it. He won a Tony Award. And while performing in Birdie, another important figure walked into the theater. Carl Reiner. Reiner was developing a television comedy that would eventually become The Dick Van Dyke Show. But there was a problem. Reiner himself had originally been the star. The network did not think it was working. That rejection could have ended the entire idea. Instead, it opened a door. Dick Van Dyke became Rob Petrie. The man who had been stuck doing work he disliked was suddenly being placed at the center of a show that would become television history. There's something almost cruelly ironic about that. The jobs he hated helped push him toward the job that changed his life. But the television industry itself was about to teach him another lesson. Fame does not always begin with people believing in you. Sometimes it begins with someone else deciding that you are replaceable. Carl Reiner's writing became one of the central strengths of the Dick Van Dyke Show, and Van Dyke later spoke warmly about that creative partnership. So the second force in this story was not really Reiner. It was the machine around him, the network, the executives. The decisions made in rooms where performers were reduced to ratings, schedules, and commercial choices. Van Dyke survived that system, and then he became one of its greatest successes. But success created another problem. People started believing they knew him. They knew the smile. They knew the laugh. They knew the man falling over an ottoman in a living room. They knew Rob Petrie. But Rob Petrie was not Dick Van Dyke. The difference became more painful with time. Van Dyke's personal life contained struggles that the television audience could not see. For 25 years, he has said he was an alcoholic. That problem did not stay separate from his family. It reached into the home. It affected his marriage. It affected his children. And eventually, he had to confront the possibility that some of the patterns he was living were not new at all. In a 2016 interview, Van Dyke spoke openly about his father, Loren, who had also struggled with alcohol. His father worked as a salesman after his baseball and music ambitions faded, and Van Dyke later recognized similarities between his father's life and his own. He said therapy helped him realize that he was repeating some of his father's mistakes. That realization is harder than any Hollywood rejection. A network can say no. A bad producer can be forgotten. A failed audition can disappear. But when a person recognizes himself repeating a pattern that once hurt him, there is nowhere else to point. There is only responsibility. Van Dyke entered rehabilitation, and during that period, his marriage to Margie Willett was already breaking apart. Their story had begun long before Hollywood fame. They married in 1948, reportedly during a radio broadcast, after a producer offered to pay for their wedding and honeymoon. They eventually had 4 children. Margie, according to Van Dyke's own account, had little interest in Hollywood. She was artistic, she was private, and she could find herself pushed aside when people around her wanted to talk to the famous man she had married. That is one of the quieter costs of celebrity. The audience sees the star. The family sees the schedule. The world sees applause. The people at home see what happens after the applause stops. Van Dyke and Willett eventually divorced in 1984. He later described his relationship with Michelle Triola as deeply happy, and they spent decades together. But that relationship also carried its own painful ending. Michelle developed lung cancer and died in 2009. Van Dyke described pretending not to know the answer when she asked whether she was going to die as the hardest acting he had ever done. That sentence says more about him than any list of enemies could, because by then, the issue was no longer fame. It was loss. He had spent his career performing emotions for other people. Now there were emotions he could not perform his way out of. And if stories like this are worth remembering, consider subscribing. This channel looks beyond the famous image and follows the quieter human stories behind the names people thought they already knew. Because the next part of Van Dyke's story brings us back to one of his most beloved performances, and one of the criticisms that followed him for decades. Mary Poppins. For millions of people, Bert is pure childhood memory. The chimney sweep. The dancer. The friend who seems to float through the film without carrying a serious burden. But the production was not completely simple. P.L. Travers, the author of the original Mary Poppins books, was reportedly skeptical about Van Dyke's casting. And then there was the accent. His attempt at a Cockney accent has been criticized for generations. Some viewers find it charming. Others find it painful. The criticism became so famous that the accent itself almost became part of Van Dyke's legacy. Yet there is an important distinction. He was not unaware of the problem. The performance became iconic anyway. That is a strange part of being remembered. Sometimes the audience loves the very thing the performer wishes had been better. Van Dyke could look back at one of the biggest successes of his career and still see imperfections. That is something ordinary people understand. A person can be proud of a house and still remember the wall they painted badly. They can love their children and still regret a decision they made as parents. They can remember a marriage with affection while admitting they were not always the partner they wanted to be. Fame does not remove that human feeling. It magnifies it. And Van Dyke had another complicated burden. He became famous for being young at heart. But eventually, he had to become old. That is a harder role than any actor prepares for. By the time he reached 100, movement itself had become difficult. He told ABC News that he missed movement and still tried to dance, even while dealing with what he called his game leg. For a man whose body had been part of his comedy for decades, that loss carried a special weight. His physical comedy was not just something he did. It was part of the language of his career. The stumble, the dance, the quick movement, the perfectly timed fall. His body had helped make him famous. Now, age was slowly asking him to give some of that language back. Yet he continued. That may be one of the most important details in the entire story. He did not pretend he was 40. He did not claim that age had no cost. He acknowledged what was becoming harder. Then he kept moving anyway. That is where the title begins to fall apart. Because the more closely the evidence is examined, the harder it becomes to construct a clean list of 5 people Dick Van Dyke supposedly hated. There are difficult moments. There are painful relationships. There are people connected to decisions he may not have liked. But hatred is not the dominant theme of his later life. Something else is. Forgiveness, acceptance, and an unusual refusal to remain trapped by the past. In 2025, as Van Dyke approached his 100th birthday, the public image remained remarkably consistent. PBS's American Masters described him as a beloved legend whose career had lasted 8 decades. And one of his longtime friends offered an even stronger description. Mel Brooks was asked about Van Dyke before the centennial birthday. His answer was striking. Brooks said he had never met anybody who had a bad word to say about Dick Van Dyke. That does not prove Van Dyke never became angry. It does not erase the mistakes. It does not make every relationship simple. But it tells us something about the man he became. He did not allow resentment to become the headline of his life. And perhaps that is the real story. The first enemy was empty work. The kind of work that pays you all quietly, taking you away from yourself. The second was the Hollywood system, a machine that could reject one performer and elevate another almost overnight. The third was addiction, not a person, but a force that affected his family and made him confront the patterns he had inherited. The fourth was his own past, the mistakes he could not rewrite, the relationships that ended, the people he lost, and the fifth was time itself. Time took away people. Time changed his body. Time turned young audiences into grandparents. Time transformed a living television star into a piece of living history. But time did not take away his curiosity. It did not take away his humor. And, remarkably, it did not take away his desire to keep living. Most people never experience the strange pressure of having millions remember their mistakes. But almost everyone knows what it means to look backward. There's a job someone wishes they had left sooner. A relationship that ended differently than expected. A decision made when they were younger. A mistake that still returns in quiet moments. Van Dyke's story is not powerful because he avoided all of those things. He did not. It is powerful because he kept changing after them. His first marriage ended. His second great relationship ended with death. His career passed through television's golden age, changing technology, changing audiences, and changing ideas about entertainment. And still, at 100, he was talking about the future. He credited his wife, Arlene Silver, with giving him energy, humor, and support. That may be the simplest explanation for why his story feels different from so many Hollywood stories. He did not spend his final years trying to prove that nothing had hurt him. He seemed more interested in showing that pain did not have to control what came next. The record does not give us 5 famous people Van Dyke publicly declared he hated, and that matters. A documentary should not turn an interesting life into a fake feud simply because the feud makes a stronger thumbnail. The real story is quieter, and, in some ways, much more revealing. Dick Van Dyke hated certain jobs. He struggled with addiction. He made choices that hurt people. He faced criticism. He experienced rejection. He lost people he loved. He watched his own body become less reliable. Yet the final image is not an angry man counting his enemies. It is a 100-year-old performer saying 1 century was not enough. He wanted more life, more movement, more laughter, more time. That is an unusual ending for a story that begins with the word hate, because perhaps the greatest thing Dick Van Dyke defeated was not another person. It was the temptation to let the worst parts of his past define the rest of his life. And there's one final mystery worth carrying forward. Every Hollywood legend has a relationship that reveals something the public never understood. For Dick Van Dyke, some of those relationships were celebrated. Others were painful. And one of the most fascinating stories, still waiting behind the curtain, is how the people closest to him shaped the performer the world eventually came to love. That is where the next story begins.